I arrived at the garden in 2010 to take up the new position for me as president. I was taken around on a golf buggy, and as I looked over my shoulder, I said, "What's that building?" And the answer was, "Oh, that's closed. It's not used." I said, "Yes, but what is it?" "Oh, that's Shaw's Museum." "Oh, can I go in?" "Well, I don't have the key." So I persisted, and I was amazed to go in and find that it was a hidden architectural treasure.
It is St. Louis's forgotten museum.
It's been a real black hole. You see it on the corner of your eye as you go by.
It opened in 1860 as a tabernacle to the wonders of nature, built by a man who was a force of nature. Henry Shaw founded the Missouri Botanical Garden, one of the first of its kind in the country and one of the best of its kind in the world. Though Shaw insisted it always be called the Missouri Botanical Garden, generations of St. Louisans have refused to call it anything other than Shaw's Garden. And the first permanent building built for the garden was Shaw's Museum. But its mission turned out to be temporary, because from the day it opened, it was too small for the garden's growing ambitions. But in a garden, even the longest winter is eventually followed by the renewal of spring.
If this building was being advertised by a real estate agent, he or she would probably say it was definitely a fixer-upper.
Now, after more than a century of drift and decline, Henry Shaw's Museum has become a museum once again, brought back to life with help from donors, big and small.
The original, I love it. Beautiful. But we're gonna do better.
I think it's fabulous. Today, when we have civic buildings and churches and strip malls, and we tear down monumental buildings and put in parking lots, it's a wonderful tool to be able to show the public what the 19th century was about.
Henry Shaw built his museum for $25,000. Restoring it would cost almost $8 million and take more than a year to complete.
Well, it is challenging, partly because a lot of it you don't really know what you're getting into until the contractor's on site and peeling stuff away.
Well, I'd like to think we know everything else, but on the other hand, when we find something like this, it's inevitable that there's other things we're going to learn along the way.
The building obviously has had lots of challenges over the years, and so perhaps they had no alternative but to cover it up, keep it safe, and wait for us to come along and conserve it in the future.
Thank you all for coming. One, two, three. The first job after the groundbreaking was the wall breaking. To make room for construction equipment, crews needed to cut a 100-foot-long hole in the garden's original stone wall. And because the Missouri Botanical Garden is a National Historic Landmark, every stone removed had to be saved and used again when they rebuilt it, so the wall would look just as it did in 1859.
The wall was not necessarily to keep people out. It was a recognition of the rural aspect of where the garden was at the time. You can imagine coming to the garden and seeing a cattle graze on your, your beautiful display of roses or something like that.
Once the wall was gone, crews were able to bring in the heavy equipment needed for the biggest job of the entire project, building a two-story glass and limestone addition to make the museum accessible to the disabled.
The very widely accepted standard for adding to an existing historical building is to add it in a different style, so that there's no question about what was added and what was the original building. That's the best way to visually keep the original building intact.
Henry Shaw is very interesting. He understands it's the middle class that's going to be the future.
And the middle class, Shaw believed, deserved a first-class botanical garden. But Henry Shaw was not a botanist. He was a businessman.
There's no sign that he was passionate about botany, but simply that he liked gardens and parks and green space and people's enjoyment and regarded them as an important and natural part of life.
Henry Shaw's favorite flower was the simple rose, but he was a complex man, an extremely private person who devoted the last half of his life to the public good. He spoke 7 languages, considered punctuality a virtue, and was said to have been the city's finest mathematician. But Henry Shaw was not from St. Louis. He was an Englishman who came to America in 1819 at the age of 19, with big dreams but little else. At first, Shaw thought New Orleans would be the place to make a fortune, selling cutlery forged at his family's ironworks back home. But when he traveled up the Mississippi on the Maid of Orleans, Shaw found St. Louis a better prospect. At the time, the city was a simple frontier village just a few blocks deep, but full of money-making possibilities, and Henry Shaw found a good one, selling hardware to pioneers headed west. Within 2 decades, Shaw was living the American dream, a century before the phrase was coined.
Turned out that by the time he was 40 years old, he had $250,000 in the bank. That might not sound like much, but that was a fortune in those days.
He says he's made as much money as anyone would need to make. He steps away from business, from that business, and he decides that he's going to live the life of a gentleman.
Shaw owned a townhouse in the city, but built another house in the country, complete with an observation tower overlooking the grove of trees surrounding the house. He called his estate Tower Grove.
What we find it hard to realize now is that the country house was 3 miles outside of the edge of the built-up part of the city, so it took a 3-mile ride on horseback to get out here.
During the early years of his retirement, Shaw spent very little time living in St. Louis, choosing instead to make 3 grand tours of the world. His final trip included a visit to the spectacular gardens at the English estate known as Chatsworth.
It's really there that he gets this idea that when he comes home, he's going to not only create his own garden at his country estate, but that he needs to up his game and create a garden for the citizens of St. Louis and the world.
8 years later, in 1859, Shaw opened the Missouri Botanical Garden. The following year, he completed his museum, which also served as the garden's library and herbarium. Among the museum's early visitors were Oscar Wilde, General George Custer, Buffalo Bill Cody, and P.T. Barnum, who told Shaw he should be charging admission. But only 3 decades after the museum opened, the garden's collection of dried plants and rare books had become so large it had to be moved to a bigger building, leaving the old building to endure more than a century of cold shoulders and shrugged shoulders. No one was sure what to do with it. By the 1890s, Shaw's Tabernacle of Botany had become a 2-story filing cabinet, labeled miscellaneous.
One of the great features of this gallery is the mural on the ceiling, which was originally commissioned by Henry Shaw from a French artist, a man called Leon Pomeridi.
His newspaper ads touted his ability to paint anything from signs to scenery, but Leon Pomeridi's specialty was the panorama. Pomeridi was a Frenchman who moved to St. Louis in the early 1830s after being hired to decorate the inside of Rosati's Cathedral, better known today as the Old Cathedral. There is no documentation proving Pomeridi painted the mural at Shaw's museum, but in 1859 he would have been the likely choice. What they do know is in 1930, the Garden hired a St. Louis artist named Harry Moss to paint over the original mural.
The roof has always had problems with water damage and leakage. So at that time they decided to replaster and lath a lot of the ceiling. They took a picture after they completed that, and they didn't take a picture of the mural prior to that. We didn't even realize any aspect of the original mural was still under there until just a couple years ago.
The latter repainting work was not as good as the originals. So part of the excitement of this restoration is to peel off the layers of paint that have been applied over the years and go back and do a faithful replica of what had been there in 1859.
And that included a border at the bottom, decorated with the names of Shaw's favorite botanists. It had also been water damaged and overpainted.
It was like wow when I saw the picture, and then when I got here, another wow.
Kumiko Hizano is an art conservator from Evergreen Architectural Arts. The Garden hired Evergreen to strip away the overpaint and then document as much of the original mural as possible.
There are always surprises.
It's always like treasure hunting, stripping the paint and then discovering the original paint.
Oh, berries. Those are little berries.
I get adrenaline rush when I see colors and then images. It's fun.
Their goal was uncovering enough detail to help a team of artists recreate the original mural on canvas and then hang it back in the same spot.
It has to be close to the original because it's a historic recreation. It's an homage of some sort to something that was really beautiful and very well done. So our goal is to be as close as possible.
To get the crew as close to the original as possible required building a 30-foot tall wall-to-wall scaffold, leaving barely enough space below for the workers trying to restore the rest of the museum's main room. The complex process of documenting the original mural would take about a month.
Some of the works are just really beautiful. You really feel privileged to be able to kind of restore it and bring it back to its original beauty.
By the turn of the 20th century, with nothing left of the original museum except the mural above and the cabinets below, the Garden tried to find other uses for the building. In the 1920s, photographer Arthur C. Pillsbury turned Shaw's museum into a movie studio. Pillsbury was among the first to use time-lapse photography to document the growth of flowers, a project he began hoping his films would persuade the National Park Service to stop mowing the wildflower meadows of Yosemite. And it worked. In the 1930s, the old museum building was refurbished and turned into a meeting hall, used by small groups like the Cactus Society, and for larger events, including the Garden's annual symposium. In the 1970s, the museum building was turned into a restaurant called The Greenery. It was also used as office space for Garden employees and visiting researchers.
One of the first scientific measurements of the actual size of a virus particle was made in the museum.
They worked hard trying to keep the old building from falling apart. But in 1982, after the Garden moved its restaurant into the new visitor center, Shaw's old museum building was finally closed to the public.
I basically went out in the middle of the room and I got a 2x2 hole, and I chipped a little bit out with a hammer and discovered the portrait.
He was only trying to determine the thickness of the original ceiling above a dropped ceiling when construction superintendent Dustin Norton found something no one was looking for because no one knew it existed.
I called our project manager right away. I sent him the picture first, I texted him. Indiana Dustin just found a portrait in the Temple of Shaw, so that's what I went with.
No idea whatsoever. There's nothing in any documents or records in the annals or history of the garden archives that indicates that there were any paintings in this particular room.
The garden's archive is filled with boxes of everything from old payroll receipts to Christmas cards. But when it comes to Shaw's museum, the only photographs that were saved barely fill 3 folders, and in several of those pictures, the museum just happens to be in the background of some other subject. A few old pictures show portraits hanging in the museum's main room, but there is nothing documenting a portrait painted on the ceiling of the room that had been the museum's library.
It's just one of those things where time marches on, and lo and behold, you just start to do a little demolition work and the past starts to reveal itself.
I knew there would be complications to the project, but it's part of history, so we got to do our part to preserve it.
The hidden portrait was a painting of Dr. George Engelmann, who played a critical role in the garden's creation. Engelmann grew up in Germany, became a physician, and then came to America, opening his practice in St. Louis in 1835. His specialty was obstetrics, but his obsession was botany.
Because he is trained as a doctor, he's learned about plants because plants are the medication, right? So if you're a doctor, you have a background in plants. So while he's, seeing people and birthing babies, his real love is wanting to go out on field trips and look for plants that he'd not seen before.
Dr. Engelmann and Henry Shaw met thanks to the matchmaking of Sir William Hooker, the director of the Kew Royal Botanic Gardens in London.
Shaw is keenly aware that he's not a professional. He needs to go to professionals.
Sir William Hooker advised Shaw that, like Kew Gardens, the Missouri Botanical Garden should include a research library and museum. Hooker also told Shaw he should get to know his fellow St. Louisan, Dr. Engelmann.
It was immediately a given once we discovered that we were going to restore it. Couldn't get any better than this.
And yet it did get better. As more of the ceiling came down, another hidden portrait was discovered. This one of Carl Linnaeus, the 18th century Swedish botanist who created the Linnaean system for naming plants. It was already known Shaw admired Linnaeus. In 1882, he built this greenhouse and named it the Linnaean. Construction workers were ready to pull down the rest of the ceiling when they discovered a third portrait. Only this one had fallen off the original brick ceiling, breaking apart as it landed on top of the drop ceiling, which they think was installed in the 1940s.
Let me see if I can poke around.
An architectural conservator was brought in to carefully remove the pieces of the broken portrait.
Oh my gosh, this is so dope.
And determine if anything could be done to save it.
Oh, this is just amazing. How stoked were you guys when you found this? Were you like, uh-oh, and awesome at the same time?
It's somebody's headache, that's for sure. But we all sort of share in the oh wow.
Oh, there's a border. Sweet. Okay, we've got a frame.
We suddenly have a really important feature to recognize.
Here's some more ornate stuff. Okay, that's just plain. Wah, wah, wah. This is great. They're all in such big, manageable pieces.
Back then, people thought that's old, either tear it down or cover it up. They might even have thought putting a drop ceiling in there was an improvement. It really is a head scratcher.
I don't know what that is. Grapes. Just some grapes, guys. Just some grapes. people were sick of decorative paint. It had been around since before the start of this country. So, you know, throwing a flat plaster ceiling up over it is definitely sort of the reaction I would have expected. And how fortunate we are that they did that, because it saved it. We got an eye! I think we're gonna get a portrait. That's awesome! We got an eye. Sorry, I'm shouting. I didn't think that we would find something in the magnitude of which we found. It is just truly incredible. Forgotten spaces, they're like unicorns and rainbows. I mean, you just love it. Okay, let's get to the name. Come on, name, give me a name. This is some hair. Oh, and a mouth. Here we go, an eyebrow. I got a name, or the top part of it. We got a G, maybe and an E.
I had an inkling that it was either going to be one of three people, and my number one pick turned out to be the correct one.
Ace of Gray. It's going to be Ace of Gray.
Yeah, Ace of Gray. Good job, buddy. So this goes with dude's face, Mr. Gray.
Asa Gray was considered the most important American botanist of the 19th century. And Gray, along with Engelmann and Hooker, would become Henry Shaw's Greek chorus, guiding him to create a garden that would be as much about science as scenery.
To get a sense of Shaw the man, I think really a lot of times you can see it in the buildings here on the garden grounds. It's the old saying, you know, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Shaw always appreciated what had come before, whether it's in architecture or whether it was in the study of botanical science. He, in his own way, wanted to contribute to moving the ball forward.
This is wonderful. As far as the portrait being saved, I mean, that's about as saved as I can make it at this point. As far as remounting it onto the ceiling, a conservator could, in essence, piece it back together and kind of stabilize it. To find something as gratifying as what's in that room is just, it's so rare.
I've always thought of maybe finding something in a wall or behind something, as much work as we do, but first time, it was exciting.
We got an eyeball. I think that's part of his hair. Oh, he's got a beard. That's what it is. This is amazing.
It's going to just be hot for the next couple of days. Extremely hot, dangerously hot. 103 today with mostly sunny skies. Tomorrow even warmer, 104. Saturday, 105.
Humidity this morning was 69%. Temperature was 79. Right now 110-ish. I think sometimes goes up to 115. It was hot, and then we were using a lot of chemicals, so it wasn't pretty. But the actual mural was really pretty.
To keep the summer heat from causing the stripper to dry too quickly, the conservation crew had to cover it with plastic wrap, making the job even messier.
We find a stripper that works. We don't want it to be too aggressive because we don't want it to eat away at the first mural that we're trying to uncover. You do test samples. You leave it on for a little while, see if it comes off, and if it doesn't come off easily, you leave it on a little bit longer, and you kind of get a feel for how long to leave it on, let it do its work and burn through those upper layers that you want to remove.
You don't just send anybody to do something like that because they can ruin it. You can erase it very easily and then you don't have any reference.
Before I put the stripper on, I look at the paint layers with my field microscope. So I kind of know how many layers are there. Sometimes I get lucky just putting a stripper and then removing it, exposing original layer. But sometimes you have to work it with your brush to agitate. You just have to feel it.
By carefully removing the overpaint, the team from Evergreen was able to confirm what parts of the mural were original and what had been added at the whim of Harry Moss.
When you see a little bit of something, it's like what is it, you know? And then you start to expose some more and then try to make sense of it. It's like a puzzle.
Before we uncovered it, was clear in most cases where the original mural still existed, because you could see where the patches were. They were a sandier finish. Once we uncovered it, we could see that the mural itself was more delicately painted, looked like a little more care given, not nearly as loose as the second one.
After removing the overpaint from all the plaster they believed had been original, work began on the most exacting part of the job, tracing details uncovered from the old mural onto giant sheets of mylar, sort of like a coloring book, in reverse.
I just follow the outlines of the areas that I know is original. If there's definite lines between the lights and the shadows, and I try to capture that as well. The notes will be added. There's a lot of the mural that we don't have any record of, so they'll take the information that we provide them and use that to interpret the remainder of the mural.
There were times when they were unsure what they were tracing.
They had been here about 2 weeks, and the head of the crew turned to me and said, "We are having trouble identifying these plants. We've called the office in New York. We're trying to find ourselves a botanist." To which I said, "Do you have any idea where you are?"
Like this crack here, this bigger crack, it actually moved.
While Tim Vanderwell mapped the mural, his twin brother Terry, who was also Evergreen's project manager, tried to help the garden staff determine the best way to conserve the surprise portraits.
What we're going to do is drill holes and inject adhesives to try and lock down, secure the plaster before the construction begins.
Of particular concern was vibration coming from work that would be happening just one floor below.
We will have the basement accessible to the public for the first time. That will become a gallery space where I'm looking forward to having botanical art exhibitions. We will be able to, in effect, have double the gallery space in this building.
The Evergreen team was able to save the portraits of Engelman and Linnaeus, first by gluing them and then by cleaning them. But the garden decided not to piece the portrait of Asa Gray back together, opting instead to have it recreated on canvas and placed back on the ceiling next to the others.
Sometimes we're not so lucky and we don't find much, but other times we have discoveries like this and it's real exciting.
To keep the museum as historically authentic as possible would mean restoring its original windows and doors, but that would require more than just a good cleaning and glue.
Everything we do here, we have longevity in mind. We want it to last a long time.
Gail Wallace owns Restoration Works in Bradley, Illinois, which specializes in using environmentally friendly methods to restore historic windows and doors.
We have a lot of tricks in our bag of tricks.
The first trick was to take all the windows gently apart.
They were milled from the good stuff, of course. That's all they had is good stuff back then.
Each piece was numbered and then sent to the stripping room, where instead of chemicals, tremendous heat was used to remove the paint. A portable version of that same process was used by another company hired to strip the museum's built-in cabinets. Once all the windows and doors were stripped, the pieces were carefully reconditioned, erasing 160 years of weathering with putty and sandpaper.
It's amazing how people compromise because, oh, what does it matter? And in this case, every person involved, I think, wants to do the right thing, and it's so gratifying because I'm in business to do the right thing, and I get all kinds of clients that don't care.
To make 19th century windows work like 21st century windows, but still look as they did in Henry Shaw's day, meant changing the glass without changing the look of the glass.
There are probably 25, 30 different types of glass in the restoration glass category, and it has different waviness and imperfections to mock the old glass. It looks like the turn of the century glass should look. This building, it's such a honey. You walk in that space and you are in another world. The shimmering, glimmering old glass with its waviness, it's delightful. We're very pleased to be involved in this project.
Shaw's Museum was designed by St. Louis's first acclaimed architect. But aside from the people living in one of the houses he designed, George I. Barnett is no longer a household name. Yet many St. Louisans are familiar with his work. It was George I. Barnett who designed this, the world's tallest freestanding Corinthian column, better known as the Grand Boulevard Water Tower. Barnett also designed the original rotunda of the old courthouse, along with Henry Shaw's country house and his townhouse, which in 1891 was moved to the Missouri Botanical Garden brick by brick. The architectural style of Shaw's Museum is Georgian, but when it came to designing the interior, Shaw remembered Sir William Hooker's suggestion that he draw inspiration from Kew Gardens' Museum of Economic Botany.
Shaw took Hooker's advice literally and essentially copied that museum. It's a little funny because Engelman actually later remarked that he wished Shaw hadn't taken it so literally because the building was a little small.
And at 7,000 square feet, it still is.
I was asked whether we would be putting the herbarium back into the museum building, and I said it wouldn't fit anymore. We had, in those days, 60,000 specimens. We've now got over 7 million.
We found a lot of flowers that were really blob.
After weeks spent performing their artistic autopsy, the Evergreen crew concluded 60% of the original plaster ceiling had been replaced, meaning only 40% of the original mural still existed under the overpaint.
There are 2.5 butterflies.
Oh, yeah!
Yay, there are!
To have any hope of recreating a replacement true to the first mural, Evergreen's team of artists would need every clue they could get about the original colors and brushstrokes. And they decided the best way to do that was to do this.
It is very important for us, if we can get to the original, to have it in our hands. Otherwise, we will just be dealing with photos, which is not exactly the same when you're recreating something, because when you get closer, you can see a lot more than from your digital print, which may or may not be the correct color.
We knew all the plaster was coming down anyway. It was satisfying to know that we were going to preserve some of it, at least in chunks.
When the sawing stopped, the salvaged pieces were stabilized from the back with plaster of Paris, then carefully wrapped and gently packed into 25 moving boxes.
We walked up on the scaffolding and identified 3 pieces that we thought were particularly representative of what the original artwork was, and they're quite spectacular. And we have salvaged those and we'll display them in the building.
With everything worth saving saved, there was nothing left to do but get rid of the rest.
It's like in music, you got different instruments. They got to play a symphony. So even these that we take from nature, they have to play the symphony of this mural.
At Evergreen Green's studio in New York City, the symphony of this mural was composed by a team of classically trained artists. They followed a new layout created in New York, based on the tracings and color sampling done in St. Louis. Master painters Boris Gusset and Zini Vesci worked side by side for weeks, trying to bring back to life a mural that had been covered over for almost 90 years.
I love working on details. It's my passion. It's to give a kick.
It is going to look amazing.
For the mural to be a success, Zini and Boris faced two challenges. The first, trying to paint like the original artist. The second, trying to paint like each other.
The time has its own soul. It is in the feeling of the original. It's not that you copy it. It's like you create with him in your mind, somehow.
It's always a thrill to try to achieve the goal of recreating something and hiding your own hand and making it look like it was painted 150, 200 years ago. And that's not always that easy to do. It's not just putting some antique finish on top of something.
We started by trying to recreate what was the original, which was this impressionistic type of painting. And then the people from Botanical Gardens said, we would like to be able to identify the flowers that you have, so it is a teachable tool for us. We can point it and we can give the name, so they need to be recognizable.
To achieve that botanical accuracy, the artists learned all they could about the plants they were assigned to paint.
You look at the structure, how the grapes behave, and afterward you go over there, you are like a grape yourself, like a leaf yourself. So that's what you do over there. So you feel yourself with the object.
This is like fine art to me. It's like artisan work. This is beautiful, nature.
It's very interesting because people now know their flowers, which is surprising. Artists are not big on gardening.
What do you feel when you're attached to somebody, attached to a girl, to a woman? It's a tremendous feeling. It's the same thing. This is my woman. Really.
Henry Shaw achieved tremendous success, not just from selling hardware, but from selling hardware at just the right time. And it was his same good sense of timing which made the Missouri Botanical Garden an immediate success.
It was the height of the time when people were moving into towns and cities during the Industrial Revolution. And it was precisely the time that people began to think about parks and green spaces. Cemeteries began being built on the outskirts of cities and became open places where people could go for recreation.
As public parks began to develop, so did a standard design, largely based on the philosophy of the country's premier landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, whose designs included New York City's Central Park.
Olmsted was just, ooh, flowers, no. But Shaw saw them as a way to learn. Olmsted was very much about a naturalistic landscape, one that let the genius of the place speak. Don't make it what it's not. Shaw is in a different camp. He wants to create this sort of library, if you will, of plants that can be a teaching tool and also pleasurable.
After he visited the Missouri Botanical Garden, Olmsted pronounced it dwarfish and paltry. But unfazed by Olmsted's harsh words, Henry Shaw continued developing his own garden in his own way for the rest of his life. But soon after Shaw died, William Trelease was hired as director. And Trelease thought the garden seemed old-fashioned and needed to be redesigned. So he hired a consultant, Frederick Law Olmsted.
After Shaw's death, there was a Olmstedian change. Shaw's garden, especially the garden proper, the herbaceous grounds and the other parts of it were ripped up and replaced with a smooth, grassy knoll that they considered to be an improvement on what Shaw had done.
Olmsted also recommended one other change: tear down Shaw's museum.
They said that the museum was falling down, was built of poor materials. I'm not so sure that that's the case, but it looked to the past, not the future.
For the garden's Board of Trustees, tearing down Shaw's museum was taking a step too far into the future. But Trelease was able to convince them the garden needed to increase its efforts in botanical research, and it has been a large part of the mission ever since, with experts from the Missouri Botanical Garden fanned out all over the world, studying and collecting plants. More recently, the garden has also started collecting plant-related artifacts.
I always find that people do connect to plants really well through the medium of understanding how they are used or were used.
It's an area of study called ethnobotany, and the garden's research center is overstuffed with examples it has collected from all over the world. But without a garden museum, there was no place to put them on display.
They've never been shown before. I think it's very important to get across the results of our research to the public, and in terms that they can enjoy and that they can relate to. And I think some of these objects are captivating.
I'm also looking forward to perhaps organizing some of those exhibits myself and displaying some of my interests in the museum. I have a personal collection of potato mashers. I've been interested in the importance of the potato and the impact it's had on Ireland and its history over the last few hundred years. I probably have about 150 of them, much to the chagrin of my wife. I acquired recently a birch bark canoe. It has also other parts of it made from other plant material. This really, from my point of view, is a wonderful illustration of the connection between people and plants from the earliest times in North America. I've tried it out and enjoyed paddling it around a local pond, and it works very well.
That canoe will now be housed at the museum, along with one of the garden's early computers, used to produce Tropicos, the world's largest botanical database. Having a museum once again also gives the garden a chance to display some of the millions of plant specimens stored in its herbarium, some of them older than the garden itself. This specimen was gathered by Charles Darwin.
I'm just over the moon to be able to finally bring them out and to begin telling the story.
Just a few weeks before Christmas, the garden received an early present. The completed sections of the mural began to arrive. But before the panels could be installed, the canvases had to be marked for alignment. And with some pieces the size of a living room carpet, it was hard finding a spot large enough to do it. The other challenge would be hanging it. The painted canvases go up like wallpaper, only the pieces are a lot heavier and much more expensive.
All right, here's the corner right here. That can't be right. And our flowers almost lined up.
When you have canvases that are 19 by 13 feet, that does make it difficult. We had 5 people installing it.
It is hard. We have to connect all the leaves. It's not like repeating same patterns. So it is difficult, but that's the fun part too. The challenges are always fun.
With the mural in place, the last job at the top of the museum was to clean up and touch up the names at the bottom. It's the only part of the original painting they were able to save. Once the mural and border were finished, the cabinets were refinished by a crew of decorative painters.
This is going to be up close and personal. People will be standing right next to the cabinets.
Instead of simply repainting the cabinets white, expert faux painters from St. Louis were hired to give the museum's cabinets a new look by giving them back their old look.
We determined that the cabinets were wood grained on the outside like a mahogany, and that the insides were just like a simple combing meant to imitate the oak. It's like painting CSI, you know. I have to make it look real. Of course, you know, the mural is the big draw, so if my work, you just pass by it and it looks like wood cabinets, I will have been successful. There's a rich history of it in St. Louis, so I just like being a part of it and being the next guy to do it.
Months after the work began, the mural was given one last check for botanical reality by Peter Weiss Jackson, who spent years trying to make the project a reality.
Wow, this looks wonderful. My goodness, there's a bunch of bananas. Most people think that bananas actually hang down, whereas this is the way it should be. Oh, look. This is the hop, which is very appropriate for St. Louis being one of the brewing capitals of the world. Well, I'm very pleased that the peacocks are not here anymore, yes. Because they were not part of the original. It was pretty challenging to restore that to the quality that we have now. You've done a wonderful job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
After, you know, all this chaos and difficulties that we have to face on site, it all go away after when I hear comments from people.
I want people to come in and be amazed and be interested in what they see, but equally to come out of there with a smile as well and say, that was fascinating. Those are some really extraordinary things. I never knew that.
If the original mural in Shaw's museum was truly painted by Leon Pomeriti, he lived long enough to see a lot of people enjoy it. Pomeriti continued painting until his death at the age of 85. He died while decorating a church in Hannibal after falling off a scaffold. George I. Barnett, the architect who drew up the plans for Shaw's museum, would go on to design other historic buildings, including the Missouri Governor's Mansion. Ironically, Barnett's grave at St. Louis's Bellefontaine Cemetery is close to the final resting place of William Trelease, the man who contemplated having Shaw's museum torn down. Bellefontaine is also where Dr. George Engelman is buried. In addition to his work with Henry Shaw, Engelman helped start the Academy of Science St. Louis, sponsor of the annual St. Louis Science Fair. After his death, Engelman's collection of 100,000 dried plants was donated to the Missouri Botanical Gardens Herbarium, including samples of several named in his honor. Next to his grave, there is an Engelman spruce, but despite his famous name, it is misspelled on his tombstone. There are supposed to be 2 N's at the end of Engelman. When Henry Shaw drafted his will, He initially left most of his property to his sisters, but in 1861 he wrote a new will, leaving his garden to the public. A few years later, Shaw gave the people of St. Louis another gift, Tower Grove Park, 289 acres of land adjacent to the garden that Shaw turned into a Victorian strolling park. Today, it is one of the few parks in America recognized as a National Historic Landmark. Even Frederick Law Olmsted said he liked it. In the winter of 1889, Henry Shaw's health was beginning to fail. By summer, he had contracted malaria. And on August 25, 1889, at the age of 89, Henry Shaw died peacefully in his bedroom at Tower Grove House. The mayor ordered city flags to half-staff and proclaimed an official period of mourning, during which the public was able to file past Shaw's open casket. The viewing was held in Shaw's museum. On the day of his funeral, all city offices were closed. Following the funeral, Shaw's body was entombed inside a red granite mausoleum designed by George I. Barnett, located between the museum and Tower Grove House. Atop the vault sits a marble effigy of Shaw he had posed for himself. In his hand, he is holding a rose. Through the years, the Missouri Botanical Garden has remained a place of treasured memories for the old and new adventures for the young. On average, it draws almost 1 million visitors a year and is widely considered one of the 3 best botanical gardens in the world, with one of the largest herbariums in the world and a research staff active in 35 countries. Although Henry Shaw the man has been gone for more than a century, his legacy continues to be celebrated beyond the garden. After all, it sits on Shaw Boulevard, across from the Word at Shaw Church, located in the former Shaw Methodist Church, in the Shaw neighborhood, which includes Shaw Place, a small cluster of large homes designed, of course, by George I. Barnett. It took 4 seasons to reimagine Henry Shaw's museum, which is now officially named in memory of Stephen and Peter Sachs, whose family provided the lead donation for the project. But if history tells us anything, it would seem to suggest that St. Louisans will probably just call this place Shaw's Museum.
The real significance of the building is its historical legacy, that it ties to the Henry Shaw vision and was his first stab at creating a facility that would be a leader in botanical science.
1, 2, 3, go.
You know, we cherish Independence Hall in Philadelphia because of what happened there. It's also turns out to be a beautiful building, but we cherish it because of what happened there. This is a similar situation. We cherish it because it was such an extraordinary vision that manifested itself in the bricks and mortar of a beautiful little building.